Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Parasitic Swallows, a panel discussion on research with vulnerable communities in conflict zones sponsored by Research for Health and Conflict. I'll introduce the panel momentarily, but first I would like to invite the audience to consider examples of unethical research practices they may have encountered and recommendations for ensuring ethical research in conflict zones. Our goal is to create a guide for researchers, PIs, funding councils, supervisors, employers, and training organizations. Our panel includes Dr. Iris Elliott, who is Head of Policy and Research at the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, and who is currently a visiting fellow at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Elliott will be discussing, among other things, how she came to coin the term parasitic swallows, transdisciplinary methods, and application of human rights principles. Dr. Sharon Mallon is a senior lecturer in mental health at the Open University. Dr. Mallon, again, will be discussing various issues, but amongst these will be what makes some research sensitive and the ethical considerations involved in recruitment and access to communities. We also have a special guest speaker, Dr. Ammar Azzouz, who will share some of his personal experiences with parasitic swallows and his work in Syria. He is currently a research associate at the University of Oxford. I will start us off today. My name is Rhonda Cerahan, and I'm a sociologist and ethnographer with over 20 years of experience in working with vulnerable communities in Lebanon and in the United States post 9/11. I'm currently affiliated researcher with the Palestine Land Studies Center at the American University of Beirut. When Dr. Adam Coots invited me to a conversation with Dr. Elliott, I instantly found a connection and a way to discuss some of my field work in the Middle East that did not always have a formal venue for discussion. It's like all these things that we feel and we talk about in private, all of a sudden came to fruition. And in reading Dr. Mallon and Dr. Elliott's work, I was like, yes, this is it. Somebody's identifying it and calling it out. So I love that. So where do, and it's under theorized. So this is a moment that, for it to be theorized and for us to discuss ways to be more ethical in our research. We're familiar with the criticism of those who get grants, get publications, build careers by writing about the lives of vulnerable populations. We could perceive these people as opportunists, and perhaps some are. But we also want to believe that many researchers begin, at least, with very good intentions and in choosing their question and the community they want to work with. So as an ethnographer, what I'm interested in, and I know the other panels are interested in, are what are the processes that enable or allow people to have to practice unethical, measures in getting data collection or how they work with people. Something happens. There's a process whereby people become parasitic swallows. Yes, there are some that it's their motivation, but then reality is we could curb such behaviors and such as unethical considerations. You can't just say, well, vulnerable communities, it's confidentiality, and so it's opaque. Trust me, I can't violate people's confidentiality, but I also can't tell you what I did or how I did it. I think that is, there's a level of laziness with those who are supervising or those who are granting permission to do this research. When we know, again, as an ethnographer in the United States, I know that the limits and the guideposts and how I'm assessed for doing research in the United States is very different from how I would be assessed if I leave the United States. So these are the things. Dr. Mallon and Dr. Elliott will give greater depth into these processes, but I'd like to argue that some researchers become parasitic swallows because they enter spaces with limited training and limited knowledge. And it's not just you read about the literature that came before you, it's much more extensive than that. Part of the missing training has to do with acknowledging the emotional toll of such research on the researcher and how that may sometimes position somebody to take shortcuts, to cut corners, to still finish a project that in fact they may not be able to finish otherwise, at least not in its original form. Then there are other limitations when we essentialize, when the vulnerable community or population is essentialized without realizing they have agency, and part of that agency is to reject the researcher. And that also, again, leads to other forms of trying to fill in. So sometimes efficiency and expediency override rigor and ethical considerations. The critical issue, again, is that we have enough experience, we have enough, even amongst this panel, enough experience and enough knowledge of ethical considerations that we could actually create a much better guideposts so that we can at least curb unethical practices, if not encourage ethical ones. So I would like to give just three of personal examples, brief examples of of my interaction with what would be called parasitic swallows. The first one is very clear. There's no, oh, how did they come to this? They were that. And this one was a study that I was involved in. I was young. I just started as a researcher, pre-PhD. I had a master's, and I was a research assistant on a post-conflict public health study in Lebanon. And there was a large-scale quantitative study, and I came in to do the in-depth interviews, qualitative. A psychiatrist from the UK had come to train us meaning me, and there was nobody else really, because it was a very small project, N of 36, which actually in hindsight is not that small. And he gave me a protocol for PTSD questions. Did not inform me what that meant or how it would be received or what I to expect or how to protect myself. So I ended up triggering people. And when I triggered people, they would fall apart, but it would become overwhelming to me, and I'd go home and cry every day. And I didn't quit because Dr. Elliott and Mallon pointed out, you feel like, but I have to do this job, I have to finish it. And then in the end, the entire study was sacked. Nothing was published. And I asked, could I at least have the interviews that I conducted so I can publish something from them? Because these individuals opened up their lives to us. We triggered their trauma, and at the very least we could tell their story. And I was told, since the whole study was sacked, I'm not to have access to those interviews, so they had to go with. Till now, 20 years later, I still think about some of those interviews, and I get emotional because they were so vivid and so scary, and I feel like I did them harm by triggering them. And so that's one. That was for me a clear parasitic swallow. The second one is a little bit different. It's the domino effect of parasitic swallows. And the domino effect to me is that after a while, the same community or the same set of families get studied again and again and again, and they get exhausted, they get fatigued. And so what happens is that the community eventually starts to reject or be suspicious of all researchers, and that's not fair to either side. And so one of the things that happens here is that, and I've seen it, and I saw it in Lebanon because I was working in the refugee camps in Lebanon, is that people would come in and they would go to the same gatekeepers, several NGOs, and these people would already have the families predetermined who they're going to talk to. And so what you end up having is a lot of publications about the communities in the refugee camps that are highly coherent, yet are not an accurate depiction of the reality of lives in the refugee camps. Why? Because they've already figured out who's going to speak, and it's the same channels. And so, that's highly problematic. So when I wanted to do my PhD research in the refugee camps, and I was told, are you going to be another one? Are you just going to come here, get our story, go get yourself a job, or go make some money off our backs and not come back? And I paused and I figured, I'm not going to do this research. I can't do this research. To me, it's unethical. They're fatigued, they're exhausted, and I can't offer anything in return. So that stopped. So this domino effect, what we're not thinking is when the more parasitic swallows we see, the less the quality of our work, and the less that communities will want to work with us. The final example is one who I would, to be generous, call an incidental swallow. And this is a incidental parasitic swallow. It was a PhD student who had happened upon my research, came to the research community that I worked with, and got initial access with one organization and one family, and didn't get access beyond that. Yet in his proposal, he already said he's going to do the entire community. It's going to be ethnographic, and all this stuff. So he did not shift. He did not say, wait, maybe I should shift my question. I should only work with the research that I have or the data I have, because he had data. Instead, he mined my work. And then when the gatekeeper in the community finally wrote to his institution that she felt disillusioned that she wasn't even allowed to see what he wrote, he sent her 2 pages of his dissertation, said that's all that has to do with your institution or organization, when he was only at her organization. His institution looked at her foreign name and wasn't interested. They questioned her credibility. And so this is another incident, I would say incidental, which leads to the work of Dr. Elliott and Dr. Mallon, because the idea that people are not questioning their emotions of how can they handle certain work, or questioning the identity of what access they will get. And so rather than admitting maybe limitations or failure, they steamroll ahead and take shortcuts to get to what they said they were going to do initially. And I think this is one of the first places where we need to pay attention, is transparency around research, methodology. We can't just say we talked to people and we met people. It really has to be more rigorous than that. And so that idea of the opaque methodology that we hide behind, or some people hide behind in ethnography and participant observation, needs to be dismantled. And so with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Elliott and then Dr. Mallon.
So just to say, I think, Sharon, you're going to go before me, and then I'll follow immediately after you.
Great, thanks, Iris. After that fabulous introduction, the first thing I'm going to say is that I do feel like a little bit of an imposter here, because although I've grown up in Northern Ireland, I haven't actually undertaken any kind of politically sensitive research there, and I've not actually undertaken any humanitarian research in the sense that that would make me vulnerable to being a parasitic swallow, certainly in the sense that Iris is going to talk about in terms of migration. But my interest in this topic is nonetheless my experience of researching is very pertinent to the topic of this seminar, because it's from my experience as a suicide researcher who's interviewed about 100 family members after the death of a loved one, that I have come to really think about the issue of harm and the harm that we do to participants and how that is hidden. And that has led Iris and I to do some work on the whole issue of sensitive research and the impact on researchers on participants. The thing about suicide is that it's sometimes really talked about a taboo topic, but I didn't find that at all. But I did find that this issue of harm was very, very hidden in suicide research. It was one it was very difficult to talk about, and you couldn't suggest very openly in conferences or in spaces when I was a PhD student that the research that we were doing might have some harm for all of those concerned. So what I want to talk about today is those issues of harm. I think that in suicide research, as in many other types of research, the concept of harm is something we're quite familiar with. Anybody who's been through ethics approval will know that you have to talk about it in your ethics approval. You have to discuss what harm your participants might come under. And so, most of you will have a healthy fear of how that might be perceived by an ethics committee. It's affected by being a professional researcher, because by the time usually you are or even as a PhD student, by the time you're applying for ethics approval, you know that your proposal has been funded either by yourself or by somebody else. And whether it's openly acknowledged or not, you have an obligation at some level to undertake that research. And to do that, you need ethics approval. And to do that at some level, you need to show that you will do no harm or that you will minimize harm. As a researcher into suicide who's predominantly looked at bereaved families' experiences and how we can learn from those, I have a healthy fear of ethics committees. At the very best experience, they find fault with what you say you're going to do, and you kind of impose conditions on you. There have been occasions where going to ethics committees, they've looked at a suicide research project and thought this is just too sensitive, and it's very, very difficult then to convince them that of the merits of the research. The reason I'm telling you is that whilst I'm not ignorant of the fact that suicide is a very difficult and challenging research, there is an argument that some of the sensitivities that we project upon some topics, it comes from an automatic assumption that that the topic might be distressing for participants and that speaking about it is harmful. And I think at some level it's these automatic judgments which lack sometimes a critical depth and an honesty that's committee. You're often going from a position of defense where you engage in a very guarded way with the very notion that you're going to cause harm, and it's that I'm particularly interested in relation to today. As an example, in suicide research with bereaved, there is a single paper which most researchers cite when they go to ethics committees. It's a paper that looks at the issue of harm by interviewing participants who took part in an initial interview, and then it rang them back up. The researchers rang them back up after a few weeks and asked them if they thought there'd been any negative consequences. There are some very obvious methodological problems with that, but the paper in itself is presented as evidence that harm in these cases, in this type of research with these participants, is unlikely. It's a very defensive stance. It doesn't take into account the intricacies of doing research or the kind of realities. And I would argue that such guarding, this behavior when we go to ethics committees trying to get approval, is quite acceptable, in the sense that it's not always possible to really predict what harm might be done. But I actually think that with hindsight, sometimes, we might have a feeling, we might have a sense that it didn't go perhaps as well as we were hoping. And I think that it's really unlikely that we see, we're talking about it here today, but, I know from my own position, I'm in a permanent position at a university. I'm relatively professionally protected now. And also suicide research is not my main area anymore, so I'm a little freer to talk about these things, but it's very unlikely that, certainly, when I started doing this kind of research, that you would see a paper published in which a researcher said, I think I might have harmed some participants. I am worried that if not all of them, maybe some of them were harmed by what I did. It's also important to acknowledge that this knowledge of harm might be insidious. We don't have evidence really of harm, not in social sciences, not in the way that it might be collected in more scientific research, where the biomedicine, or I used to be involved in pharmaceutical research, and there's adverse events. There are all sorts of problems with the reporting of that, of course. But in social science research, I'm not sure we always ask participants if we harmed them. And even if we did ask, as the example I gave earlier, participants might not feel that they can tell it, certainly if it's the same researchers. But I have to say that, in echoing some experiences that have already been shared, in my experience, sometimes there's a gut feeling or a niggle at the end of an interview when the person you've interviewed seems a little deflated or disappointed somehow, or perhaps it's ultimately when your research is published and you think it hasn't had the impact and you've somehow let down your participants by not communicating on their behalf, that you sense that somehow there were lessons to be learned from your research. However, I do think that certainly there's, especially in contract research, where you're maybe moving from job to job, and the world of academia is very competitive, there's no real space for confessions of these kinds. I think we're all relatively established in our careers here, so we're perhaps a little bit able to be more open. And I think if, certainly in the early days, I found that I had my own personal absence in that. In my doctoral thesis, there is, which was about the experiences of friends bereaved by suicide, there is a chapter missing. You wouldn't see it. I know it's missing. I wrote it, I edited it, I proofread it, and then we took it out. And it was about the harmful impact that I felt the research might have had on me and on some of my participants, not all of them, but on some of them. I took it out on advice and discussion. I have to say it was a mutual decision based on the advice of my supervisor. But in some sense, and this is what I've been working with Iris with for a few years, I've attempted to kind of break out of the glossing over that I did in the thesis. I was, very clear in my thesis, or in the absence of saying that that I hadn't caused any harm. So this is my second and final point, which is that it is harmful to the researchers. I haven't got much time left, but you know, in my opinion, there's no kind of doubt. And certainly the research that Iris and I have done and the special issue that we published would show that other researchers feel the same. And that's why we're here, to start the conversation, to challenge the taboo, and to try and talk a bit more honestly about harm, but also to publicize the fact that our research showed that the harm is mitigated if the researcher is clear on the best benefit, if they're thinking about their research, so that the relationship is not so parasitic, and that they're thinking beyond the PhD or the journal article or the funding grant and trying to produce something more meaningful and impactful, and that is protective to both the participants and the researcher. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll kick off my input then. When I was 5 or 6, I was walking home from school with my best friend Janice and her mum Doreen. We were walking, we were stopped by a photographer on our suburban street who wanted an image of children from war-torn Belfast to illustrate a story in the local paper that evening about an incident that had happened to other children on the other side of the city. With a child's ethics, my interpretation was that the photographer was lying. I thought that they were too much of a coward or too lazy to make the effort ahead of their deadline. Rather than ask for an authentic image from the people who had actually experienced that violence, they misrepresented us all and silenced our voices. Last week, the UK papers marked 10 years since the start of the war in Syria. I opened the weekend supplement and experienced the big picture feature. The photo was of 2 girls described as play fighting in a transparent tent in a public park in a named town in Turkey. The Syrian father was described as too paranoid to tell the Danish photographer his daughter's names. The children's faces and the family home are entirely identifiable in this image. There's no anonymity, no privacy, and no right of reply. The Danish photographer described seeing people drown and people crawling as families under razor wire. We read of refugees as his study, his obsession, how indefatigable he is, and the challenge of his readjustment when he returns home. You can buy his latest book for £35 sterling, or get £5 off if you order from the newspaper's bookshop. Those of us who come from conflict-impacted societies will recognise the commodification of our lives and the lionising of external experts who construct their narrative of our lives, and the monetising of these narratives, benefiting creatives, journalists, researchers through profiles, book deals, and jobs. So why did I coin the term parasitic swallows, and what does it mean? As an adult, what I observed is that there is a migratory pattern to the flocks of external researchers coming into the north of Ireland. They arrive in the summer, academic holidays coinciding with some of the most contentious annual events, such as our marching season and our commemoration of internment without trial. Swallows are migratory birds travelling between the global north and south, freely moving between spaces that are ambient, that provide sustenance for them to live safely and productively. I won't labour the metaphor of the value and importance of freedom of movement and of migration. Parasitic is a visceral term. To draw on cultural theorist Stuart Hall, it is an encoded linguistic device. It provides a psychic space in which I process the maddening, unethical practice of professional peers. When I meet with people from my own or like backgrounds, it is readily decoded with an expression of recognition and connection. Yes, us too. And I suppose when I first met with you, Randa, there was this mutual recognition and shared experience. And when I was recently speaking with colleagues in the community sector in Northern Ireland, we spoke it too. Yes, and still, even after peace settlement dated 1998, still they come. Parasitic Swallows is an expression of my agency. It's a response to researchers who swoop into my home, feed off the carrion of trauma data and then fly off again without providing any benefit to research participants or their society, perhaps doing harm, re-traumatizing, and preventing people from evolving their identity beyond the conflict. In Ireland, we have an expression, neither use nor ornament. Researchers who are parasitic swallows are neither use nor ornament to anybody but themselves and possibly their institutions. I recognise that there's a diverse set of professional persona at play. To characterise or to caricature, they are the well-intended but unconnected, the well-intended and connected, for us, including generations of the Irish diaspora returning to the homeland of their foremothers and forefathers, the prurient and the ambitious who leave a ribbon development of conflict research into a career path of qualifications, positions, publications, and grants. Research and data are huge resources for conflict-impacted communities. They can be used to record, to inform, to direct, and to persuade. The spending of significant resource for little impact is not what researchers, funders, or research audiences want to occur. However, although there is ethical guidance and mechanisms, there is still extremely poor practice happening. Conversations such as our gathering today are timely and urgent. It is critical that all actors are engaged, including researchers at all career stages, institutional review boards, funders, and local gatekeepers such as academic institutions, NGOs, and INGOs. Full participation in these conversations requires a recognition of the power dynamics that are present, development of research literacy amongst communities, including exercise of their own agency and right to say no, and an openness to consider sanctions by institutional review boards and funders. I think it's important for this to be a transdisciplinary conversation. To date, there have been substantial contributions to the field of sensitive research from my own traditions of feminist research and critical social science. Situated within an emancipatory consciousness, critical social scientists aim to provide a catalytic explanation of the social order, which leads to the transformation of that social order. The emancipatory tradition asserts that academic discourse is not only a descriptive and explanatory enterprise, but also a political and transformative endeavour that intends social change. This is an unashamedly political and partisan stance, embodied in the identity of the scholarly activist. Researchers who are scholarly activists stress the importance of the researcher's identity, their location, their standpoint, and ongoing self-reflexivity. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights published a human rights-based approach to data as part of the Sustainable Development Agenda. They outlined the following principles: participation, self-identification, disaggregation, transparency, privacy, accountability. I propose that these human rights principles provide touchstones for our discussion today. To conclude, I want to say something about the importance of voice. I value the opportunity that we have to have time with yourself, Randa and Sharon, because I feel that it's really important that this conversation is led by researchers from conflict-impacted humanitarian and fragile settings. I hope we hear from researchers with such backgrounds today. I believe this is an ethical conversation that is necessary and overdue. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me today. I'm a short-term research associate in Oxford Uni and analyst at Arab, but I'm speaking on personal capacity. So this weekend on Friday, at a moment of anger, living here in the UK and seeing what's happening in many academic institutions, I've written few sentences on social media saying that as a Syrian in the UK, I have seen how some UK-based academics turned our pain and trauma into an opportunity for them, who saw in us a funding opportunity Many of them wouldn't speak the language, know our struggle, or care about us. But hey, it's good for the academic career. This is a shorter tweet that I put on social media and make it like a thread. And then I also noted in one of the comments that how many times have we attended a talk on Syria without any Syrian in the panel? It felt like going to Pride without any gay marching, or like an International Women's Day without with all men panels. But it's fine. They are all Syria experts, and we are not. These are some of the lines that I wanted to, just like for 1 minute or two, to tell you about today. And this tweet that I just put at a moment of anger, it has been viewed for more than 500,000 times. And I have more than thousands of impressions on it, of maybe thousands of people liking or retweeting it. And what was shocking and really moving and profound is seeing the importance of this topic, the relevance to many people who wrote that I'm from Mexico, I'm from Venezuela, I'm from Iraq, from Palestine, from Lebanon, from Syria, from Kenya, and I feel your pain. And many people from these countries and many others felt that the story of us, the pain, the trauma, the struggle, the narrative is stolen from us. And I think that was just so profound. I really wasn't expecting all this impression, but it just shows how much we need to open these uncomfortable, unsettling questions that we're seeing it happening. We see that the impacted people are very often excluded from the conversations about them. They are very often silenced. They are very often used as tools for funding opportunities, as platforms to get awards and progress in careers and opportunities by people who really know little about these people that they are supposed to be serving between brackets. And I reference some of the articles that have been written about this, including the work of Professor Dawn Chatte on the humanitarian aid and what she uses at the aid tourism of many people going to places like Amman in Jordan and Beirut in Lebanon, who are from the most prestigious and elitist backgrounds, but they go to study, let's say, Syrian refugees. And it's almost like a tourism for some of these people, neglecting the struggle of the people, disoriented, alienated from the pain and the struggle, and whitewashing the pain of the people. So I just wanted to share these few questions with you on what is needed today to change, because Sharon, for instance, mentioned that some of us are well established in our career and we can feel comfortable to talk about it. But I think many people are silenced, and they are not daring to ask these questions. And we see it happening, we feel uncomfortable. So what could be done? How could things change? And I will just stop here because I promised to speak only for a few minutes. And thank you so much for having me today.
I mean, thanks for asking that question, Amar. I mean, that's a question that maybe can kick us off, but I don't know, Randa, if you want to maybe draw some comments from what we said, or if there's particular questions that you're seeing coming through from other participants.
Yeah, I think it's amazing what the response that Amar got. And I think that's actually disheartening in some ways and heartening in others, because again, what we're hearing is that those who are in the conflict zones are very aware of what's going on. So this idea of we're essentializing, they're just glad that somebody's listening to them, because that's sometimes what you hear people say, is that they just want their story told. They're just happy to tell their story. And that's not necessarily true, because there's always a cost. So I'm heartened that Amar got this response, because that means those who, you know, we're seeing as our participants or the respondents, the individuals living in these conflict zones are very invested in their own story, and they're tired of the exploitation. And so, you know, I just appreciate that interjection. And back to your point, Iris, is that I think, yeah, these ideas of, you know, the human rights principles, accountability, transparency, you're saying they're already there. And that's, I think, the point that I also want to make, is that we have these abilities, we have the knowledge, and there's a choice in either not enforcing or not holding people accountable, or evading them because the reward is bigger when you're not as rigorous. So I just wanted to say that. And sorry, one last thing about community is with, like, when people walk away and then they don't give back to, you know, to the community, or they don't engage the community in the findings, the community will close down, it will shut off. And that hurts both, because information needs to be out. And yet, if you're, you know, if you're capitalizing on somebody or monetizing somebody's information, that will just close them off. And so there's this kind of catch-22 where the story needs to be told. It matters who tells it and how they tell it.
Yeah. I mean, for me as well, I think in terms of building on what you've asked, or that question you posed us there, Amar, but also I see this coming through in the chat. For me, it works on two levels. I mean, I talk very personally about the fact that, like, I call people parasitic swallows for my own agency, for my own way of psychologically containing what it's like to be from a conflict community and see this. I mean, this is going on, well, my whole life, but you know, this is decades as an adult and as a researcher seeing this kind of practice, having my life explained to me by people who know nothing but feel, because they've been the tourist, the research tourist, or the tourist to Northern Ireland. So I think it's really powerful what you're talking about there, Amar, in terms of, you know, lighting a spark and people having a space, if it's on social media, to then be able to sort of say, me too, to have that recognition, which I think, I mean, Sharon and I have with each other, but also I immediately had with Randa when we started to talk about this. But I think as a senior researcher, I mean, I think this is about kind of trying to create some sort of systemic change. And Sharon and I have talked a lot about this, and in our research articles, we were trying to sort of think, okay, well, what can, you know, researchers do? What can educators do? What can ethics advisors do? What can funders do? I think there's a complexity to this in which it's not one thing, it's a number of different things. And I think kind of one of the things, Randa, that you have, I suppose, really make me think about, it's this idea that we need to sort of encourage researchers to be sensitized, or research professionals to be sensitized in some kind of way, and then thinking, what can I do in this context with my particular role? So for me, I think about things like, as a socio-legal scholar, there are human rights principles. I can do some work to kind of read those human rights principles into this context and use that potentially as a bit of a framework. From this conversation today, we can put together some kind of guide or research briefing. Let's just surface it and give people a way to continue the conversation. I see in the chat there's colleagues who are researchers, PhD research at the minute. So kind of like, how do you talk to each other as peers? How do you think about it yourself? How do you self-reflect? How do you talk to your supervisor about this and think, you know, what are the ethics of what I'm proposing to do? Should I continue to do it? If I do it, what would that actually mean? So, I mean, those are my initial thoughts around it. I think there's a lot we can all do, but it's kind of from different perspectives, and also from different places of safety, I think, as well.
And I think what we've tried to do, which is what my supervisor encouraged me to do as well, is to not just put it out there, but to put thought into it, to reflect on it in an academic way that moves us forward. Because I think, you know, there's no point in just saying, you know, oh my God, my research was so emotional and difficult. You know, as academics, we need to really reflect on it and engage with it on a level that is academic. You know, and that's much more likely, I think, to get the attention of other researchers to get published. You know, Iris and I have published 2 papers now, and we also encouraged other researchers who were working on sensitive areas to similarly reveal. And when in a collective, in a special issue where we were all revealing something, that had a particular power, and it has connected with people. So, and I think that's something that certainly we could look at doing with harm, you know, coming together as researchers and producing something where each of us reveals something, and we're less vulnerable when we're all doing it. Because when you stick your head up above the parapet and say, I'm a bit worried about my research, that means you are less likely to get funded. That's, you know, you'll be, you know, you're quite quickly gain a reputation. It's a very small academic world. But when we all do it, it becomes a bit more of a movement, and that's exactly what you need if you want to make change. If you want to be a social activist, you need to bring people with you. It makes you safer, and it gets people's attention, I think, in a more powerful way.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, I'm just looking at the chat there. I mean, I'm so happy with this because I'm starting the drafting of the research briefing. So I'm going, yes, all of those things that people are now suggesting. So things like psychological support for research participants. I know Sharon and I, when we first met, when Sharon was doing suicide research, she had therapeutic supervision as a suicide researcher. So actually sort of thinking you actually need to put psychological care in for researchers in this area as well, because as I think you've touched on, Randa, you know, some of this is about people in quite an isolated way trying to fix a situation or research that isn't working, or research that they didn't realize what it was going to be like when they get into the field. So some processing for participants as well as the researchers. Just personally, Mary Montague is one of my colleagues from Northern Ireland. Thank you so much. I feel very emotional when I'm reading your response to what I've said about what people have been going through in Northern Ireland. And one of the things Mary and I have been talking about is about, you know, can I offer some pro bono training to community groups in Northern Ireland? Because I think this is really important, this idea of research literacy, but also people having the right to say no, like to the point that I think, and I'm not saying this has come from Mary, but from my talking to other colleagues in Northern Ireland, like people are being harassed by academics and really forcefully pursued to say, I want to come into your community. I want you to meet people with me. I want you to navigate this for me. And it's actually really, I think it's really, really difficult. And I would bring into this, as I've sort of said, I think there needs to be these power dynamics. This lens needs to be very revealed. And that's why I started off with a personal story, because, you know, when we were 2 little girls walking down the street with our mom, it was, you know, working class people. I'm the first person in my family to ever get to university. Some photographer comes up and says, can I have your picture? You know, and I just, when I saw that picture in the UK paper at the weekend, I just thought, oh my God, this father is a Syrian refugee. There is no protection for him or his daughters. And you have this European photographer putting his camera in front of them and then labeling the father paranoid. You know, there's so many power dynamics here. So I do think there is something about going back to that part, the principle of participation, making sure that everybody can participate in this conversation, because I think we as researchers benefit from it, but hopefully the communities do as well. So to have that really research literacy, to have that sense of empowerment that you can say no, you can say a lot more than no to people who behave in such a way, but how do they support it? And I do think, you know, maybe this research briefing will be the start of something that is more expanded and substantial, because my idea is that we would have something that people could refer to, communities could refer to it, other researchers could refer to it, institutional research boards would be saying, if you're going to do this kind of research in this kind of setting, I need to see that you've actually engaged with some of these kind of ethical texts, and you're going to tell me how you know, maximize and benefit, and how you minimize in harm, how you manage in the risks. So, but thank you for I mean, I'm just really encouraging people to keep putting stuff into the chat, because there's so much material coming through there.
I'd like to answer the question about, you know, do research realize that they may cause harm? And I would say, not really. And I'll answer why. Partly is that if you are in what becomes a controlled setting, it's almost a fabricated setting. And if you're going to the same gatekeepers, the same NGOs, the same community associations, and they're taking you to the same families. There's this controlled setting that people are already accustomed to, and so it's kind of like it is very much like tourism, and so that's one. So that when you have that kind of control setting, the idea that you're doing harm isn't evident, and with that comes that your partners, whether it's NGOs or associations or local, whatever it is, activists, it's the idea is that they have an interest in projecting their story, and they have an interest in, or they feel that they need the funds, because sometimes there's exchange of funds. So I think the controlled setting is something we have to think about, and that diminishes the sense that you're doing harm because you have a local taking you around. Second, always when we ask, and the IRB says, what are the harms versus what are the benefits? They'll say, well, the harms might be that, we opened up, their wounds, but it's minimal, not any more harmful than what they're already experiencing. But then what they'll say is something like, but the benefits are so much more important because we get their story out, we tell the truth. And I heard it from people in the field. They say like researchers will actually lie about the ability to speak to their governments and affect policy so that they can get more responses. And then finally, which Iris has already mentioned, is the hero. The hero complex is also institutionally bound. And so I've heard many times when researchers come from the United States or the, England, the UK or whatever to Lebanon, their own advisors will say they were heroic. They went to a conflict zone. You know what? They could have been sitting at a hotel. It doesn't matter. The idea that these are the heroes. So automatically, if you're a hero and there's risk to you, then you're doing somebody else a favor. And I just wanted to touch the last thing about Iris and the ethical considerations. Absolutely, this is something that can be insisted upon by supervisors, by ethics committees, etc. Because even when we do research in the United States, part of that ethical consideration, part of those dilemmas that we have, actually we treat as data, and it's good data, because then you can reflect, you produce better work if you're reflecting on your own emotions, like, did these people irritate me? Wait, that irritation might be data for later on. So I think it's not only just ethics in the larger sense, but it's better research, better product, if you are taking into consideration your own emotions and your own impact on the research.
Can I comment something on the harm that could be caused by research? And I think very often we associate harm with people who might be opportunistic or they want to make opportunities out of this. But I would also just want to add that even when people have good intentions, they can cause harm when they really lack the context and understanding, i.e. they might look at a refugee camp as a site for technological experiments or applying new things or being selective on what they want to study, designing that experiment or a study case, let's say in Amsterdam or London or Boston, and then go into vulnerable communities and say, oh, we're coming to help you. But then without understanding what are the real needs and priorities for the people. So harm is not only limited to people who are causing harm and they maybe know, but even to the people who might not know and they really have good intentions. And I think that's why it's so important to have a huge understanding on the situation, on the context, on the politics and the powers and the language and the culture of the people that we are engaging with. And also just to add on a comment that mentioned on maybe researchers often they go and leave with no benefits, but also they would tell their own story and they will take it from the voice of the people. So millions of pounds have been spent in the UK on researching Syrian refugees in Lebanon. But a lot of these situations, the voices of the people, the refugees are unheard, or they aren't speaking or telling their own story. So the researchers who are studying these people, they come and they are celebrated here, but almost like without acknowledgement or engaging with the voices of the people. So I think there's a huge issue on raising, we often say that we are partnering with people in the global south, but it's one-way direction. It's not partnering. You still have people interrupting others in conversations, speaking above them, not giving them the ability to present their work, ignoring their opinions, silencing them. So you still have all these dilemmas. They call them partners, but only on a paper because they want the money. They call them partners. Oh, we have a partner now in Jordan or in Lebanon or I don't know where. But eventually they aren't partners, and they do the work and they present it as one person, two persons, whatever powerful institution is. So I'm just these 2 points to highlight is that good intentions could also cause harm. And the second one, partnership. What is partnership? It's giving the opportunities for everyone, giving the people we are supposed to help the ability to say the story, not taking it on their behalf and saying, I have the power to say their story, and I should be the person who should tell their story. Why not the people?
I mean, one of the things that Sharon and I find when we did our original roundtable around sensitive research was with people who did research into topics that were very close to their hearts. And I suppose when I was talking about that typology, you do have the kind of well-intended unconnected, and then you have the well-intended connected people. And so, I mean, and I think it's going back to what Sharon has said, like trying to facilitate a conversation now where we as researchers can start talking about this and in a very, you know, critical way, self-critical, critical of the field, etc., critiquing, and being, well, for me, being a critical social scientist. But I think there is something about thinking through that pathway. Why am I doing research in this area at all? What, you know, actually some self-reflexivity. Why am I choosing this for my PhD topic, my master's topic? Why am I going into this field? And then to understand what is my relationship with this field. And again, like with my typology, this idea that like we have a lot with the Irish diaspora. People go into this field because they feel a connection with the north of Ireland. They've been reared with stories of the conflict and British colonialism in Ireland. So there's a relationship there. So, but I think across all of the different stages of it, and the thing is, this takes time, it takes reflection, it takes talking to your peers, talking to your supervisors, it takes accessing good training to really think through it. Like, why am I in this area? What am I curious about? You know, starting a dialogue with people who are engaged in that area, particularly people who are not in any way connected to a particular area. Because one of the things that really struck me when I was working in academia was it's a huge resource. You know, when I look at the money, I mean, people are, I know on the chat, I can see people are talking grants and they're talking millions, which, you know, when you sort of, and I agree, a lot of millions spent without very much impact or outcomes or utility. But even for a community organisation, a master's thesis is what, like maybe about 10 grand's worth of, £10,000 worth of research asset. And what really intrigues me is that sometimes students and supervisors seem to think it's a private party. Like I have to think this all up in my head. I don't talk to anybody about it. I go to the library, I read my books or whatever. I might talk, you know, quietly to my supervisor or people in a training situation, but I don't actually just go and say to people, like, do you have questions? You know, like somebody in Belfast, do you have questions? What are, you know, people in your, is there something that I can do that's helpful? Or if you're looking from a scholarly activist point of view, go into NGOs and say, if you had the asset of whatever, £10,000 worth of research, what can I do that is useful for you? I mean, it changes the dynamic, you know, so there you're not asking, you know, you're not sort of saying, I want to go in and do this, hold my hand and navigate it for me and, you know, surround me with spurious credibility and authority. You're actually just saying, I have this resource. Is this resource useful to you? And in that, I use the example often of, I did some work for marriage equality in Ireland when we were trying to have marriage equality for lesbian and gay people in Ireland. And the campaign came to me and said, you know, everybody talks about us like we're not safe with children. So you can't let the gays marry because then they're going to have kids. And of course, lesbian and gay people in Ireland have had children for a long time. This isn't going to suddenly happen with, you know, the right to marry. And so I did this tiny piece of research with children in the community, guided by the steering group for the marriage equality campaign. That, what is a really small piece of research, was entered into the discussion on the constitutional referendum in Ireland. It was cited in a legal case in Northern Ireland around the right to adopt, you know, but the dynamic was very different as a researcher. It's like, I'm committed to this area of sensitive research. I kind of know why, because I've I practice self-reflexivity, but I didn't, you know, in some ways I do feel sometimes it's an arrogance amongst researchers, like what we know what the questions are. We know what the change is that needs to happen, without actually having a dialogue with people and actually being prepared to hear from people. We don't want your research, that's not helpful for us, go and pick something else, you know. But it is something, having worked for, say, like Community Foundation for Northern Ireland, worked a lot with community organizations, I do think actually potentially these are resources, but they're resources that are kind of chucked away in a very, if you think of how many masters theses are done every year, how many PhDs are done every year, you know, there's another way potentially of looking at this when I'm thinking about the principle of participation, but combined with the principle of transparency as well, you know. Actually, I don't have any of these policy contacts. I don't really know how to write a policy recommendation to save my life. I need to work with you to help me to do that. So, I mean, that's another way of thinking about why would you just try and flip some of this around as a research practitioner.
There was a question about basic needs somewhere, but I'm struggling to keep on top of the chat, I'm afraid. So apologies if we've missed some people. I think we're running out of time. So do we want to say anything in conclusion, or do we have a bit more time?
I'd like to answer if possible. I know it's kind of, we're going around the same question, but it's fine. I think it's so fine because the same question is being asked in different ways. And it's the question that says whether any of this behavior is attributable to researchers' naivete or limited resources or very strict funding resources restrictions. And yeah, of course there's researcher naivete, but that's inexcusable. And it's inexcusable at the institutional level because there has been so much research done. We have so much experience. Why would we send naive researchers into conflict zones or to study vulnerable communities? It's entirely inexcusable. And you know, we haven't talked about enough, but it's real, that it's not just the funding, it's also race. Like, you know, if you're a white male, it really matters, you know, that you're going to get the funding and that you are entering these spaces. So that's a whole other thing. Then you know, and who monitors? It should be advisors. It should be ethics boards. For instance, when I said, you know, like people rejecting, and Iris just mentioned that, when I started my like preliminary research, they said, why are you here? Like, you know, we're tired. Are you another one of those? That to me signaled they don't want me to do this. But they would have done it because I had enough contacts to insist on doing it if I chose to insist on doing it. And then the other thing is, who was my advisor? My dad. He said he started doing research in the refugee camps in the 1970s. One of the first people to enter the refugee camps. He goes, do we really need more explanation about what's happening in the refugee camps? Do you think your work will affect their lives? Or is it something else that needs to be done? And that sealed the deal for me. I knew that one more study is not what we needed. People are aware. It's something else. And so, yeah, the idea that we need to respond. Are they signaling in one way or another, even in their weak or vulnerable states, we don't want you. We need to respect that.
I think that links with the comment, the question that's just come in, which is about have academics become journalists and lost their robustness and rigor. I'm not sure if we've lost, maybe I'm naive, but I'm not sure if all of us have lost our robustness and rigor. But I think there is, and we have to continue to push as PhD supervisors, as kind of, you know, academics in this field. We have to resist the temptation to become journalists. And sometimes it's easier to be a journalist and it's more publishable to be a journalist and to really truly challenge is harder, and it's harder to get a good reft paper if you're being completely outlandish. Sometimes I think, and we've all been schooled in this, there's a middle ground which is easier to get published in the big journals, and so I think we all need to resist that. And I think many of us went into this, including myself, to change people's lives. And you know, I haven't done the type of research I came into doing, brief family interviews about why people die by suicide, because I feel like we kind of know a lot about why people die by suicide. We need to change how we look at this issue, and we need to put some money into mental health services. So, you know, and I think this is you know, there are parallels there in that, you know, as Randa was just saying, you know, the experience of being in a refugee camp may be quite similar, or certainly we probably know if it's quite similar to being in one in 1970. So what are we going to do about it? How are we going to help change those lives, and how can we change policy today? So if, you know, if you're doing research now, you should be interviewing people with a view to today's context and moving it forward, rather than just describing, and even just reflecting on your experience of being in there is not enough.
I mean, I just want to pick up one of the last comments there, which was where we were talking about institutional review boards, and are we really just talking about procedural ethics? And certainly that's something that we will explore in the research briefing. And actually, if I refer you to the sensitive, the special issue that, and now ebook, open access ebook that Sharon was one of the editors on, it's a really rich resource in terms of talking about all different types of ethics. So there is like the procedural ethics, but there's lots of other types of ethics that are kind of create a multi-dimensional understanding of what types of ethical activity may need to take place. I suppose where in some ways we talk about institutional review boards and procedural ethics, and also talk about funders, is that there needs to be sanction, because I think for all that, you know, there is possibly an unintended element to this. You know, another type I talked to earlier on is people who have this ribbon development of conflict research, and they built an entire career around it without any form of evaluation before they get the next grant or the next publication, as to like, was that any use? Was that ethical research? Did that do harm, etc.? So I think with all of this, because, and I think Amar, the response to your social media engagement shows this is a really significant ethical issue at scale across the globe. You know, I know the first time I contacted you, Randa, I call these people parasitic swallows. Maybe you feel like that's overstating it. You were like, no, it is not ours. These people are parasitic swallows. You know, we're touching on something from this conversation, and I hope this has been really helpful for people. But I think it is a start of something, because I just think it is a global ethical challenge within our professional field of research. And I think at the hardest end of this is about sanction. This is about, you know, like there's an ethical collective responsibility as a group of research to say, we are observing this, and the more we talk about it, the more we are aware this is going on, and this is a problem at scale. You know, it's at the scale of millions of dollars and millions of euros and millions of pounds worth of research, and therefore there is a need ultimately to talk about sanction. And that's why I'm thinking about institutional review boards and the scrutiny and how they operate. But I absolutely agree, it's not simply procedural ethics we're dealing with here. It's a cultural ethical issue. Thank you.
There was also a question about sharing. I think Adam's going to be able to share the list if we want to continue the conversation and forming some kind of network that we can move this conversation forward, either you know, by publishing or trying to, I know Ash is doing a briefing on it, but I think Adam will be able to share contact lists with people who consent to. Is that right, Adam?
Yes.
So, I mean, hopefully we've addressed quite a lot of the issue. I know everybody's looking to see the chat function to just check if there are any outstanding issues. But I mean, certainly if people are interested in continuing to be involved in the conversation, we'll be just turning around to quite a short research briefing immediately after with this, and we will have a conversation about how can we look at networking colleagues will just need to think about data protection and not necessarily giving everybody's name out straight away, but working out some kind of way in which, if you're interested in carrying on the conversation, you can kind of opt into some kind of process around that. But thank you. I mean, I'm just so delighted. We've had such great engagement. This is incredibly rich conversation, and thank you, Rhonda, for chairing us so well.
Yeah, thank you all. And thank you for all the great questions. I really do hope we continue with this, because I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface of something much bigger.
I have made a lot of notes and scribbles, so.
So if there are no additional questions, I think we can end, and Adam will take care of the next step. Right? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.